instrument tray hit the atrium floor, and the sound of it, that bright, flat, ringing clatter of steel on tile, was the only thing that moved in a room of 40 people, who had all, in the same half-second, stopped breathing. A major general stood at the bottom of the podium steps, with his hand still half raised, gone completely still. Preston Vaughn, the trauma chief who one breath earlier had called me the wound care girl into a live microphone, set the microphone down on the podium, very carefully. The way you set down a thing that has turned hot in your hand. Nobody picked up the tray. Above us, the building's air handler kept turning over in the vents, slow and indifferent. And it was the loudest thing in the room. I stood at the back, in faded blue scrubs, holding a clipboard, and I watched the general start walking the length of the atrium toward me, and I thought only one cold, clear thing, with the precision of a woman who has waited a long time for a room to rearrange itself around her. He recognized the dog before he recognized me. But to explain why a major general crossed a hospital atrium to come to attention in front of a nurse nobody in that building had ever looked at twice. I have to take you back 11 days. To the gray afternoon. A war dog came through the ambulance doors. At a dead run. The dog came in, and a room full of people, who had spent their whole careers learning to stay calm under pressure, forgot how. A respiratory tech dropped a clipboard. A first-year resident pressed himself flat against the supply cabinet, like a man avoiding a passing truck. Somebody's coffee went over, and the brown spread across the white floor, in a slow, deliberate way that I would remember later. The way you remember small things, from the worst and best minutes of your life. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, lean and scarred, and built like something assembled for a single purpose. And he moved through that chaos, without acknowledging one human being in it. He was searching. I knew that gait. I knew the way a working dog sweeps a room, and discards every face that isn't the one it's looking for. I had spent 3 years of my life, watching dogs like this one do exactly that. In places with no floors, and no clipboards, and no spilled coffee. Only sand, and noise, and men I was trying to keep from dying. He found me. At the far end of the corridor. I was holding a chart, and standing very still. The way I had taught myself to stand still, a long time ago. And he crossed the last 20 feet at a walk, and he stopped in front of me. And he leaned the whole weight of his shoulder and flank into my shin, and let it settle there. The way a dog leans into the one thing in a room he has decided he can hold himself up against. The whole room turned to look at the woman. Nobody at Halvorsen Memorial had ever looked at twice. The nurse they gave the shifts, no one else wanted. The one whose clinical notes got skimmed. The one Dr. Preston Vaughn called honey in front of patients, when he was feeling generous. And the wound care girl, when he wasn't. They had no idea what they were seeing. They should have. It had been standing in front of them for 2 years. If your throat just tightened a little at a dog crossing a room full of strangers to reach one person, then stay with me, because I am going to tell you why that animal did that. And the why is going to take you somewhere none of the people in that hospital saw coming. Hit subscribe so this story finds you again. But before I explain why a war dog with 9 years of training ignored every doctor in that emergency room to lean his whole weight against the leg of a woman everyone there had decided was nobody, you need to understand what they thought they knew about me. Because what they thought they knew was the whole point. I had built it for them, one quiet day at a time. And what happened in the 11 days between that dog and that drop tray, the man who'd spent 2 years deciding I was furniture, never saw coming. My name is Iris Holloway. I was 51 years old that spring, and on the employee roster at Halvorsen Memorial Hospital in Cedar Hollow, North Carolina, I was listed as a registered nurse, wound care and general floor, per diem, with a standing assignment to whatever shift the scheduler couldn't fill. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, above a shuttered hardware store. with a window that looked out on a parking lot and a water tower, and furniture that I had bought the way you buy furniture, when you don't plan to be looked at. A couch, a table I used as a desk more than a table, and a bookshelf I never assembled. So the books lived in stacks on the floor, like a city I hadn't finished building. My left knee told me, when the weather was about to turn. There was hardware in it, a titanium plate and 4 screws, and on cold mornings it spoke to me, in the specific dialect of metal that has been inside a body for a long time. I want you to remember that hardware, because it matters later, more than you'd think. It was honest metal. It had been put in by a surgeon at Landstuhl, who told me exactly what it was, where it came from, what it could and couldn't do. And then it had done precisely that, for 14 years, without one lie. I had learned to move, so the limp didn't show. People who limp get questions, and I had spent a great deal of energy not getting questions. There was a garment bag in the back of my closet, behind the winter coats. I hadn't unzipped it in 3 years. I knew exactly what was in it, folded the way I'd been taught to fold it. The silver oak leaves, still pinned to the collar. And I had put it there, on the last day I was allowed to wear it. And I had decided, that day, that the woman who wore it was a person I was finished being. I'll tell you about the day I finally put my hand on that zipper again, but not yet. When the new nurses asked where I'd worked before, they always asked, because I was older than the charge nurse, and I didn't act like someone who'd come up through the usual ladder. I would say I'd been overseas, in medicine, and let the sentence end there. Overseas, in medicine. It was true. It was also a door I closed gently. Every time, before anyone could walk through it, I let them believe it, that I was a competent older woman, who'd taken up nursing late in life, who knew a little more than she should about trauma, and never quite explained why, who could read a hemorrhage 2 minutes before the monitor caught up, and chalked it up to instinct when a doctor asked. I never corrected the assumption that I had nothing behind me. There were reasons, we'll get to all of them. What I will tell you now is only this. When Preston Vaughn looked at me, and saw a tired woman in faded scrubs who should be grateful for the hours, he was looking at exactly what I had built for him to see. I had chosen the oldest scrubs in my drawer. I had let my badge photo stay the bad one. I wanted to know how a place treated a person it believed had nothing to offer. I found out. That's the part nobody warns you about. Once you've decided to be invisible, the world is happy to help you finish the job. And there was a postcard, taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet door, where I'd see it every morning, when I reached for a mug. A cheap postcard, the kind they sell in a wire rack at a gas station, with a picture of a mountain I had never visited. On the back in block letters from a man who could field strip a rifle blindfolded but wrote like a 3rd grader, were 7 words. I read them every day, for years. I'll tell you what they said, and who wrote them, and why he never got to send the second one, but I have to earn that. The way he earned it, and so do you. Preston Vaughn did not arrive in my life as a villain. That isn't how it works. Contempt doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a small, deniable thing, and it gets bigger only when nobody pushes back. And by the time it's the size of a problem, everyone has quietly agreed not to see it. He was the trauma chief at Halverson. 44 years old. Good-looking in the way that men who have never been told no, stay good-looking. With a reputation in 3 counties, and a habit of describing himself, in meetings, as the reason the hospital had a level 3 trauma designation at all. He wasn't wrong that he was skilled. That was the part that made it work. People will forgive a great deal in a man who is genuinely good at the visible parts of a job. The visible parts. There are always invisible parts. And the invisible parts are where the truth lives. And Preston Vaughn had never once in his life been asked to account for an invisible part. The first incident, and I'll be honest, I didn't think of it as the first of anything at the time. I'd left that kind of thinking behind on purpose. Happened in my third week. A man came in off a logging accident on Route 9. Crush injury to the pelvis. And the desk clerk had him in the general queue because his blood pressure looked stable. It looked stable, the way a dam looks stable. I had walked past 1,000 men who looked exactly that stable, and were 30 minutes from gone. I moved him myself, back to monitoring, and I flagged the retroperitoneal bleed I couldn't see, but could feel in the shape of his belly, and the gray underneath his tan. Vaughn came in, glanced at the monitor, and said, in front of the patient, "Let's not let the floor nurses play doctor, all right? We'll order imaging, when imaging's indicated." Imaging, when they finally did it, showed exactly what I'd flagged. The man kept his life. Vaughn never mentioned how he'd gotten to the table so fast. He never did. That was the pattern, and I want you to see it clearly, because the pattern is the whole engine of this story. The save was his. And the instinct that produced the save was, in his telling, a nurse who'd gotten lucky, and gotten lippy. He didn't steal the credit dramatically. He just let the room assume, and a room will always assume in favor of the man with the title. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with a man like Preston Vaughn only teaches him your weak points. I lowered my center of gravity, the way you do before impact, and I kept working. The second incident was a month later, and it was public, and it was no longer deniable as a bad day. We had a kid, 19, motorcycle versus guardrail, and a junior resident named Daniel Cho, who was about to make a mistake with a chest tube that would have dropped the kid's pressure off a cliff. I caught Cho's wrist, gently, the way you correct someone you want to keep, and I told him where the landmark actually was. 2 ribs lower than where his hand had drifted. And why? Vaughn heard the tail end of it from across the bay. "Nurse Holloway," he said, and he let my name sit in the air like a thing he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. If you've got opinions about thoracic procedure, the application for medical school is online. Until then, hand the man his instruments, and let him learn. Cho looked at the floor. The kid on the table looked at the ceiling. I handed Daniel Cho the instrument, and I guided the placement with 2 words and a look. And the tube went in 2 ribs lower than Vaughn had been about to let it, and the kid's pressure held. Daniel Cho found me an hour later, by the supply closet. He was young and decent, and embarrassed for me, which was worse than if he'd been embarrassed of me. "How did you know that?" he asked. "About the landmark. You said it before I even..." I told him I'd seen a lot of chest tubes. He said, "Where?" And I gave him the door I gave everyone. "Overseas, in medicine." He nodded like that explained something. And it didn't. And he walked away, carrying a small confusion he'd forget by his next shift. He didn't forget it, as it turned out. But that comes later too. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being right in a room that has decided you can't be. It isn't the being right that tires you. It's the arithmetic. You learn to calculate, every single time, whether saying the true thing is worth what saying it will cost. And you do that math so many times that it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like the temperature of the air. 3 weeks, 2 months, 140 shifts a year, 420 over 3 years. And on every one of them, the same small calculation, the same small swallow, the same lowering of the center of gravity. Write that number down somewhere in your head. 420. I'm going to give you a bigger one before we're done, and I want you to feel the size of the small ones first. The third incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I understood that the problem wasn't Preston Vaughn's manners. It was something underneath the floor. A woman came in, 60, diabetic. A hip replacement 4 months earlier at Halverson. Textbook surgery according to the chart. And now a wound over the hardware that would not close. And a low-grade fever that wouldn't break. And a white count that climbed a little every week. They had her on her 3rd antibiotic. The orthopedist was baffled. Vaughn signed off on poor host healing and non-compliance. which is the thing a hospital writes down when it has decided the problem is the patient. I packed that wound twice a week, for 6 weeks. And I have packed a great many wounds in my life, in a great many conditions. And I knew, the way you know a song from the first 2 notes, that I was not looking at poor host healing. I was looking at hardware that was seeding infection. Not from a dirty operating room. Halverson's operating rooms were clean. From metal that was not what its paperwork said it was. I had seen that exact smolder before. That specific signature of low-grade osteomyelitis around an implant that should have been inert, and wasn't. I had seen it in a place with no floors. And I had filed a complaint about it once. In a different life. 3 forms I typed and signed and walked up the chain myself. Reviewed by a colonel named Garrett Vance. And dismissed in a single paragraph. That complaint was the reason I was standing in faded scrubs in Cedar Hollow, repacking an ulcer at the end of a double. Instead of doing the thing I had trained half my life to do, I pulled the lot number off the implant record. I wrote it down on the back of a parking receipt, and put it in my coat pocket. The manufacturer was a company called Arlen Medical. I want to be precise about what I felt when I read that name. Because precision is the only thing I have to offer you that's worth anything. I did not feel surprised. I felt the specific cold that arrives when a thing you'd told yourself was behind you turns out to have been waiting at the next bend in the road the whole time. Arlen Medical. The same company. The same product line, 6 years and a lifetime later, screwed into the hip of a diabetic grandmother in a county that no one important ever thinks about. And that was the night, I'll tell you, because it's the honest part, that I first wondered whether I had ended up at Halverson Memorial by accident. People who get pushed out of the army for filing the wrong complaint do not, as a rule, get to choose where they land. They land wherever the current takes them. I had told myself, for 3 years, that Cedar Hollow was just where the current happened to take me. Small town, small hospital, nobody asking questions, a quiet place to be a person, instead of a rank. But the night I copied Arlen Medical's lot number onto the back of a parking receipt, a different thought arrived, and it would not leave. Nobody restructures a surgeon out of the service for naming a defective supplier, and then lets her wash up, by pure chance, in the one small hospital where that exact supplier's product is failing. In exactly the way she said it would. The water doesn't carry you to the thing that drowned you by accident. Somebody chooses the river. I didn't have proof of that. I want to be careful. I had a cold feeling, and a parking receipt, and a colonel's name on a 3-year-old dismissal. But I started keeping copies after that, quietly. The way you keep a thing, you might never get to use. Here I'll give you the breathing scene. Because every true story has one, and because you've earned a minute where nothing happens. On Sundays I didn't work, most weeks. And most Sundays I drove 40 minutes out to a state forest, where there was a trail I liked that ran along a creek. My knee didn't love the climb, so I'd brought it down to a slow walk years ago. And the slow walk had turned out to be the better way to do it. There was a flat rock about a mile in, where the creek made a sound I have never been able to describe to anyone. A kind of low, continuous conversation. And I would sit on that rock and do nothing. Not think about the hospital. Not plan. Not calculate. Just sit and let the creek talk. And let my knee ache honestly in the cold. And feel, for 1 hour a week, like a person who did not have to manage how she was being seen. Because there was no one there to see her. Except a creek that had no opinion about whether she was a nurse, or a colonel, or a tired woman on a rock. I'd unwrap a sandwich and eat half of it, and give the other half to whatever birds had figured out the rock meant food. And then I'd drive back. And on Monday I'd put the oldest scrubs back on, and Preston Vaughn would call me honey, and the arithmetic would start again. But on the rock, for that hour, there was no arithmetic. I needed that the way you need one room in your life where you are allowed to be exactly your real size. Everybody needs that room. A lot of people don't have it. If you're one of them, I'm sorry, and I hope you find your rock. There was one more person in that hospital I owe you the truth about. Because the easy version of this story makes everyone who wasn't me into a monster. And that version is a lie. And lies are what we're here to be done with. The charge nurse was a woman named Brenda Okoro, who had been at Halverson for 19 years. She was not cruel. She was tired in the way people get tired when an institution is the only stable thing they have. And she had made her peace with Preston Vaughan, the way you make peace with weather. She gave me the bad shifts, because giving me the bad shifts was the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance had kept her employed for 19 years. She wasn't wrong that it worked. She just never asked what it cost the person standing at the bottom of it. But once, and I held on to this, the way I held on to everything. Once, near the end of a double, Brenda watched me repack that diabetic wound. Watched the granulation tissue I'd coaxed back over 6 weeks of patience nobody had asked me to spend. And she said, almost to herself, "You're wasted on wound care." And then the phone rang, and she answered it, and the moment closed, and she never said it again. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, in a way that rearranged how I'd thought about her for 2 years, was that Brenda Okoro had been quietly making her own copies too. Every chart of mine that Vaughan skimmed and dismissed, every flag he overrode. She had been pulling them and keeping them in a folder in a drawer in her house, for reasons she could not have fully explained to herself. For the same reason I kept mine, because the day you put a record in the trash is the day you admit it was never going to count. As for Brenda Okoro, underneath 19 years of making peace with the weather, she could not bring her hand to do it. I didn't know that yet. The night I copied Arlen Medical's lot number, I thought I was the only one in that building keeping a record. I was wrong. But it would take a dog to prove it. It had been raining for 3 days. The kind of low, gray Carolina rain that doesn't fall so much as hang. That gets into the parking lot and the hallways, and the mood of everyone who walks through them. The ambulance bay smelled like wet asphalt and diesel. My knee had been talking to me since Tuesday, the metal in it reading the pressure drop like a barometer. And I'd been moving carefully, so the limp stayed mine, and not the room's. The paramedics rolled the gurney in at 4:10 in the afternoon, and the man on it was conscious, and pale, and the kind of weathered that comes from years outdoors under a hard sun, rather than years of hard living. Mid-40s. Lean. He had a soldier's stillness even in pain, which is a thing I can recognize from across a room, because I spent 3 years learning to read it. The difference between a man who is calm and a man who is conserving. His left leg, below the knee, was a running prosthesis. Carbon fiber, scuffed and serious. The kind a man wears when he refuses to be slowed down by the thing the world took from him. His right thigh was wrapped in a field dressing that had been done one-handed, and done well. And below the dressing, the wound was deep and bleeding through. And beside the gurney, matching its pace exactly, harness on, eyes doing that systematic sweep and lock that no civilian dog has ever done in its life, was the Malinois. Handler's a vet, the paramedic called out. Name's Wyatt Boone, fell on rebar at a construction site. Deep lack to the right thigh. Dog wouldn't let us load him till Boone told it to. Dog's name is Atlas, I said. I said it before I had decided to say it. I said it the way you say a name you have not spoken in years, and did not know was still sitting in your mouth, fully formed, waiting. The paramedic blinked. Yeah. How'd you? I didn't answer him, because the dog had stopped at the sound of the name, and turned his scarred head and looked at me. And I looked at him. He was older. We're all older than each other remembers. There was gray in the muzzle that hadn't been there, and there was a scar, low on his left flank, long and clean and slightly raised, the way a well-healed surgical line gets. And I knew that scar, the way you know your own handwriting, because I was the one who had written it. There had been a 9 years and half a world ago. A convoy hit on a road we called Route Tampa, a coordinated ambush at 0:40 in the morning. and a forward surgical team in a plywood structure that was never built for the kind of night that found us. In the first 90 seconds,
11 wounded.
4 more, before they broke contact. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, in the middle of it, 2 soldiers carried in a working dog with his abdomen open, who had taken shrapnel pulling those same 2 men behind cover. There is a rule about that, about using human surgical resources on an animal in a mass casualty event. The rule says no, and the rule is correct. And I have defended the rule to younger surgeons, who wanted to break it for worse reasons. But I looked at that dog, and I looked at the 2 men whose dog he was, one of them holding pressure on the animal's belly with his own bare hands, while blood ran down to his elbows. Both of them with that specific look that men get when they have decided, without saying so, that they will not be able to keep going if this last thing is taken too. And I made a decision you are not, strictly, supposed to make. I had my hands inside that dog at 2 in the morning, under a generator light that kept cutting out, while the world outside came apart. And I closed him, and he lived. His name was Atlas. And he was standing in the emergency department of Halverson Memorial Hospital, looking at me like I was a thing he had been trying to remember for 9 years, and had just, finally, found. I want to be honest about the next part, because it is the part that matters. Training took over. Not the surprise. Not the 9 years and half a world away grief that was trying to climb up my throat. Training. I was on my knees beside Wyatt Boone's gurney, before I had finished processing that the dog was Atlas, because the man was the patient and the dog was not. And I had assessed the field dressing, and the bleed through, and the gray under his tan, all in the time it took me to lower myself, me complaining, to the floor. "Mr. Boone," I said, "I'm going to look at your leg. You did a good rap. Did you do it yourself?" Atlas was in the way of my right hand, he said, through his teeth. So, one-handed. Of course he was. I almost smiled. The dog had positioned himself, even bleeding the man out, to be between Boone and whatever the threat was. That was Atlas. That had always been Atlas. I need to tell you something before anyone else gets in here, so you don't worry. Your dog is going to be fine in this room. I know what he is. If he gets agitated, I'll know before anyone else does, and I'll tell you first. Understood? Something moved across Wyatt Boone's face. Not relief. Recalculation. The look of a man revising who he's talking to. Understood, he said. And then Preston Vaughn came around the corner, saw the dog, and said the thing that started the clock. "Get the animal out of my department." He said it without looking at the patient. He said it the way you'd say it about a piece of furniture in the wrong place. "I don't care whose it is. This is a sterile environment, and I'm not having a stray." "He stays," I said. And I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't reach for a statute, because the man on the gurney was already watching the dog, instead of his own leg, and that told me which problem was the urgent one. His handler's blood pressure is tracking that dog's stress. Not mine, and not yours. You separate them, and the next thing you're managing is a hypertensive crisis on top of an arterial bleed. The dog is a clinical variable. Treat him like one. Vaughn looked at me then. He looked at me the way he looked at me, which was the way a thermostat looks at a hand reaching to change its setting. "The wound care girl is going to lecture me on hemodynamics," he said, to the room, inviting them to enjoy it with him. A couple of them did the thing people do. The half-laugh, that costs nothing and means everything. "Sweetheart, take the dog wherever dogs go, and let the people with degrees handle the leg." I stood up. My knee complained. I let it. "The leg has an arterial component," I said. "Level. And if you cut that dressing without controlling proximal pressure first, you'll have a fountain. I've already got proximal control. I'd recommend you keep it that way." The bay went a particular kind of quiet. Not because I'd raised my voice. Because I hadn't. Vaughn's jaw did something. He had 2 choices. He could find out, in front of his staff, whether the wound care girl was right about the artery. Or he could pretend he'd been about to say the same thing. He chose the second one, the way men like him always do. "Fine," he said. "Keep your pressure. We'll get him to a room." And then, because he could not leave without the last word or it didn't count, he said the smaller, uglier thing. And somebody put it in the chart that the nurse insisted on bringing a dog into my trauma bay. So when there's an infection, we'll all remember where it started. He said it like a joke. But here is the self-revealing thing. The thing he didn't know he was telling the whole room. Preston Vaughan's first instinct, looking at a bleeding veteran and the dog that loved him, was to build a paper trail that would put the eventual blame on a nurse. Not to treat, not to triage, to document who would be at fault if it went wrong. That is the entire man, in one sentence. He had spent his whole career making sure that when something failed, the failure had somebody else's name on it. He just didn't know yet how much of what was failing in that hospital already did. I made a quiet, deliberate decision then, kneeling on the floor of an emergency room with my hand maintaining pressure on a stranger's femoral artery, and an old soldier's dog watching my face. I decided I was done letting them believe it. Not loudly, not yet, but done. I got Wyatt Boone to a room in the back corridor, away from the traffic, which was better for him, and for the dog, and for Vaughan's blood pressure. I irrigated and assessed, and confirmed what I'd known from the bleed pattern. The rebar had nicked the femoral. The laceration ran deep enough to need vascular repair. And it needed it today, not tomorrow. I charted it with the kind of specificity I knew from experience would be half read. And then I flagged it for the surgical consult anyway. And then I sat for a minute in the chair by the window, while Boone's vitals stabilized and the dog lay down at the foot of the bed. The way lodge dogs lie down, like a structure deciding a location, is now load-bearing. "You were forward surgical," Wyatt Boone said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer right away. "The way you went to the floor," he said. "The way you said his name. The way you talked to Vaughan." He shifted against the pillow. "I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of medical people in the last few years. The good ones learned it somewhere. That wasn't a classroom." He looked at me, and there was something careful in it. "You knew Atlas. You said his name before they finished saying it." "I closed him," I said. The words came out quieter than I meant them. 9 years ago, he took shrapnel. I had my hands in him, at 2 in the morning. The room was very still. "Helmand," Boone said. "Route Tampa. The Mass Cala at the FST." It was not a guess. It was a man fitting a key into a lock he'd been carrying for years. "You weren't there," I said. "I'd remember you." I wasn't. But I know who handled Atlas before me. Atlas came to me when his first handler was killed. 2 years after that night, different deployment. An IED outside Mosul. His name was Cole Mercer, Sergeant First Class. He's the one who carried Atlas in that night. Him and another guy, holding the dog's guts in with his hands. I knew that. I had been looking at Cole Mercer's hands when I broke the rule. I had not known his name until this moment, in a hospital room in Cedar Hollow. From a man Mercer had never met, 2 years after Mercer was dead. That is the thing nobody tells you about the people you save, and the people you save things for. Most of the time, you never learn their names. You do the work in the dark, and the dark keeps the names. He talked about a surgeon. Boone said, "A woman." He said she wasn't supposed to operate on the dog and did it anyway. He said the men called her. "Don't," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. The way one soldier accepts a boundary from another, no questions. And he didn't say it. But I knew what he'd been about to say, and so do you. Almost. You'll have the word in a minute. And you'll have Cole Mercer's 7 words too, before this is done. Because they turn out to be the same story. And I didn't know that yet either. That night, I did something I had not done in 3 years. I sat at the table I used as a desk, and I pulled up a number I had not dialed since I left. and I called a man named Hector Reyes, who had been my surgical tech in Helmand, who had held retractors for me at 2 in the morning while the world ended, who, as it happens, had been standing on the other side of that plywood room the night I closed Atlas, and had not said a word about the rule, and had handed me the instruments for the dog, the same way he handed them to me for the men. He ran a wound clinic for veterans in San Antonio now. He had asked me, every Christmas for 5 years, when I was going to stop hiding. He answered on the second ring. "Valkyrie," he said. Just that. Like no time had passed. There it is. That's the word. That's what they called me. I'll let it sit there the way it sat in Hector Reyes's voice, warm and certain. A thing that meant something to him, that it had never meant to anyone at Halverson Memorial. A thing I had folded into a garment bag and zipped away 3 years ago, and not let myself hear since. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to not make it a whole thing." "Too late," he said. "What's wrong?" So I told him. About the implants. About the diabetic woman, and the smolder I knew from a different life. About the lot number on the back of a parking receipt, and the name on it. Arlen Medical. The company at the center of the complaint that had ended my Army career. The complaint about falsified sterility and biocompatibility testing that I'd filed, that a colonel named Garrett Vance had reviewed and dismissed, and that had been followed, 11 weeks later, by the reorganization that erased my billet, and sent me, by what I had told myself for 3 years was chance, to Cedar Hollow. And then I told him the cold thing, the thing the parking receipt had made me wonder. "Hector," I said, "I don't think I landed here by accident." He was quiet for a while. When he spoke, he said the thing I'd needed someone outside my own head to say. "You didn't," he said. "Iris, listen to me. Nobody erases a lieutenant colonel's billet for naming a supplier, and then lets her wash up, by pure luck, in the one small hospital where that exact supplier's product is failing, exactly the way she said it would. That's not a current, that's a hand on the river. Somebody put you somewhere, they thought you'd be too tired, and too overlooked to notice. Somewhere your judgment would be discounted by default. They didn't make a mistake leaving you alive. They made a mistake leaving you alive, next to the thing." He let that breathe. "Send me what you've got, dates, charts, lot numbers, and that colonel's name. I know people who've been waiting 6 years for a witness, with both credibility and proof, to walk through the door. You're the only one who ever had both. They just had to make sure nobody would believe you. And Iris," his voice changed, "there's a name you should know, is in town." He told me there was a regional veterans service event at Halverson that Friday. The VA was recognizing service dogs, and the handlers they'd been matched with. And he told me who was headlining it. I went very still, in my apartment above the shuttered hardware store, with the rain hanging gray outside the window, and Cole Mercer's postcard taped inside the cabinet door 6 feet away, because the name Hector said belonged to a man who had been a 26-year-old captain en route Tampa, the night the convoy got hit, a man whose company I had kept breathing on a plywood table, until the sun came up, a man who was now a major general, and who was coming to my hospital on Friday, to put a medal on the chest of a service dog's handler, Atlas's handler, Wyatt Boone. "Be there," Hector said. "Just be there. Be in the room. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to say a word, trust me. You just have to be in the room, when he walks in." I sat for a long time, after I hung up. Then I got up, and I opened the kitchen cabinet, and I looked at the postcard, the way I looked at it every morning. Except that this time, I let myself read it slowly. All 7 words, in Cole Mercer's 3rd-grader block letters. Cole Mercer, who had carried a dog's life in his hands, and then gone back out and lost his own outside Mosul. Who had bought 2 of these cheap mountain postcards in some PX a lifetime ago, and written the same 7 words on both, and sent me one, and kept one. I'm still not going to tell you what they said, We're almost there. I just wanted you to know I read them that night, and that I understood, for the first time, that the man who wrote them was gone. And that the words were the only part of him that had made it home. Friday came, gray and clearing. The 3-day rain finally breaking up by mid-morning into that washed, fragile light the Carolinas get after a long front passes through. They held it in the hospital's main atrium, the big 2-story space with the donor names on the wall, and the bad landscape prints, and the temperature of a room where no one ever opens a window. There was a podium, and a folding chair audience, and a banner. And there were more uniforms than Cedar Hollow usually saw in a year, because a sitting major general does not travel alone. I was there in my scrubs. I had thought, the night before, about wearing something else. This is the part about the garment bag. I promised you. Thursday night I stood in front of my closet, with my hand on the zipper of the bag I had not opened in 3 years. I could feel the shape of it through the vinyl, the jacket, the silver oak leaves, the years. I stood there long enough that my knees started to ache from standing still, the honest metal in it reading the cold. And then I let the zipper go, and I closed the closet, and I laid out my oldest scrubs on the chair, for the morning. Because here is what I had learned in a harder school than most. The reveal, when it comes, can never be you presenting yourself. The truth does not arrive because you announce it. If you announce it, you've made it a claim. And a claim can be doubted. And a woman in a uniform, insisting on who she is, can always be made to look like a woman insisting. The truth only really arrives when someone else recognizes it, when it stands up in a room on its own legs, with no help from you. I didn't need the uniform. I needed to be in the room. The rest was Cole Mercer's general, and a scar shaped like my signature, and a man who could not stop himself from reaching for the last word. So I stood at the back, in faded blue, holding a clipboard, like a woman who'd been told to keep an eye on a patient, which I had been, because Wyatt Boone was the patient being honored, and Brenda Okoro had assigned me to wheel him down and stay with him, never once imagining what she was building. Atlas sat beside Boone's wheelchair in a fresh harness, gray muzzle, steady eyes, and a clean surgical line on his flank that nobody in that room could read but me. Preston Vaughn was there too, of course, in the front row, in a good suit, because a sitting general at his hospital was exactly the kind of visible thing Preston Vaughn arranged his entire life around. He'd been working the room all morning. He'd shaken the general's aide's hand twice. When he saw me at the back in my scrubs, he came over, because he could not help himself, and he said, low, with a pleasant face for anyone watching, "Try not to let the dog embarrass us today, honey." Big crowd. Then the general's party came through the atrium doors, and the room stood the way a room stands for a general, and Major General Tom Caraway walked to the front. He was older than I remembered. He had the same way of moving, though, the contained economy of a man who learned a long time ago that a leader's panic is contagious, and so is his calm. He went to the podium. He thanked the VA, and the hospital, and Cedar Hollow. He talked about service dogs, and about Wyatt Boone, and about what it means that a country asks some men to give a leg, and then asks them to ask for help, which is harder. He was good at it. He'd given the speech before. And then Preston Vaughn, who could not stand to be in a room with this much importance and not be seen to belong in it, did the thing that ended him. When General Caraway opened the floor for the hospital to say a few words, Vaughn went to the podium. Uninvited, but smoothly, the way he did everything. He talked about Halverson's commitment to veterans. And then, because he was incapable of leaving without making someone smaller, he gestured at me at the back of the room. And he said, into the microphone, to a major general and 40 folding chairs, and a wall of donor names. And I want to thank our support staff, even our floor muscles, who I'm told insisted on bringing this fine animal into my emergency room last week, against protocol. A ripple of indulgent laughter. We don't always agree, the nurses and I, on what belongs in a trauma bay. But I suppose, in the end, we find a place for everyone. Even the wound care girl. In the back. He smiled at me. He wanted me to shrink. It was the most public, most confident contempt he had ever aimed at me. And he had delivered it in front of the highest status person in the building. And he had built his own witness without knowing it. And the gap between his contempt and what came next was about 4 seconds long. Because General Tom Caraway had turned to follow Vaughn's gesture. And he was looking at the wound care girl, in the back. And his face was doing the thing I had seen happen exactly twice before in my life. On the faces of men who'd just realized the world was not arranged the way they'd thought it was 1 second ago. He had gone completely still. Somewhere to my left, a nurse's aide who'd been carrying a metal instrument tray for the post-ceremony reception lost her grip on it. And it hit the tile floor, and the sound of it, that bright, flat, ringing clatter of steel on hard ground, cracked across the atrium like a shot. And then there was no sound at all. None. I could hear the building's big, quiet breathing in the vents over our heads. The slow turn of the air handler, somewhere above the donor wall. 40 people, and a general and a dog, and not one human sound. General Caraway came down off the podium step. He did not look at Preston Vaughn. He walked past Preston Vaughn, as though Preston Vaughn were a coat rack. He walked the length of that atrium, past the folding chairs, past the donor wall, with every eye in the room tracking him. And he stopped in front of me, the wound care girl in the faded scrubs. And for a moment that lasted a great deal longer than its actual seconds, he just looked at my face. The way you look at a face, you'd given up on ever seeing again. Then he turned to the room. I want to tell you that I stayed composed. I did, on the outside. I had a great deal of practice. But I will also tell you that I had to set my jaw a certain way, and breathe through my nose a certain way, because of what he said. And because I had not heard anyone say it out loud, in a room, in front of people, in 9 years, in 2015, General Caraway said, and his voice carried without him raising it, the way a voice carries when 40 people have stopped breathing to hear it. I was a captain. My company was hit en route Tampa, in Helmand Province, at 0:40 in the morning. Coordinated ambush. We took 11 wounded in the first 90 seconds, and 4 more before we broke contact. Some of them were hit bad. The kind of bad where the clock is the enemy, and there's no air support, and the nearest surgical capability is a Roll 2 forward team in a plywood building that was never meant for the night we were about to have. Nobody moved. Preston Vaughn stood by the podium with the microphone still in his hand, and his face the color of the donor wall. That team had one surgeon running the table. Caraway said, she worked 19 hours. She did damage control on men I'd grown up with. She made calls that night that I have spent 9 years being grateful she had the nerve to make. Because every one of them was right, and not one of them was easy. 14 of my soldiers walked out of that war, because of decisions she made in the dark, with the power cutting in and out. He paused. I watched him decide whether to say the next part, and decide that he would. And around 3 in the morning, 2 of my men carried in a working dog with his belly open. He'd taken shrapnel, pulling them behind cover. And there's a rule about using human surgical resources on an animal in a mass casualty event. And the rule says no. And she looked at the dog, and she looked at the 2 soldiers holding him together with their hands. And she broke the rule. And she closed him, and he lived. The general looked down at Atlas, sitting by Wyatt Boone's wheelchair, with his gray muzzle, and his steady eyes, and his clean surgical line. That's the dog, he said. I'd put my pension on it. There's a scar on his left flank, like a signature. One of the men who carried him in was named Cole Mercer. We lost Cole outside Mosul, 2 years later. He never stopped talking about that night. He said the surgeon gave him back the only thing he had left to lose. And then Major General Tom Caraway turned back to me. And in front of his aide, and the VA, and Preston Vaughan, and 40 folding chairs, and the whole staff of Halverson Memorial Hospital. He came to attention, and he said, "It is an honor to be in the same room as you again, Colonel." And then, to the room. Without taking his eyes off me. We called her Valkyrie, because she decided who came home, and she decided all of them. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. The signature of my whole adult life is that I let people believe what they need to believe. And the corollary is that when the truth finally stands up in a room on its own legs, you do not rush to help it. You let it stand. So I said nothing, and I let it stand, and the room held it. Behind the general, in the third row, an old man in a VFW cap I hadn't noticed, got slowly to his feet. He didn't say anything, he just stood. A few seconds later, a younger man 2 rows back, missing an arm below the elbow, stood up too. And then a woman in the back I'd never met, who I learned later had buried a son who came home, once, because of a forward surgical team in another province in another year, stood, one at a time, with the long scrape of folding chairs on tile. The veterans in that room rose. Until the only people still sitting were the ones who had never worn the uniform, and Preston Vaughan, who was still holding the microphone, and who set it down very carefully on the podium, as though it had become hot in his hand. The aftermath, the part Vaughan would replay for the rest of his career, was this. I didn't look at him. I want to be honest, because I promised you I would be. I had imagined, across 420 bad shifts, the moment Preston Vaughan would finally understand. And when it came, I went looking for the thing I'd rehearsed, some heat, some settling of an old debt. I went looking, and it wasn't there to find. He had become very small, and very far away. The way a thing you've climbed past looks from higher up. So I looked at Atlas instead. The dog had stood up too, at some point, and crossed the few feet between us, and leaned his weight into my leg, against the honest metal, against the cold weather ache, and I put my hand on the back of his neck, and that was the only thing in that entire room I could feel. What happens after a major general calls a wound care nurse colonel in the middle of a hospital atrium is not a movie. It is paperwork. It is meetings. It is the slow grinding of institutions, deciding how much they are going to admit they got wrong. It went faster than I expected in some ways, and slower in others. The fast part. Hector Reyes had not been idle. The documentation I'd sent him, 2 years of charts, lot numbers, the pattern of failures, cross-referenced against Arlen Medical, and a colonel's name on a 3-year-old dismissal, had landed on the desk of people who had been waiting 6 years for a witness, with both credibility and proof. I turned out to have both. A retired lieutenant colonel and board-certified trauma surgeon does not get called a floor nurse playing doctor twice, once the people in the room know what she is. And then Brenda Okoro did the thing I had no idea she'd been preparing to do for 2 years. She came to me the Monday after the ceremony, in the break room, before her shift, and she set a folder on the table between us. A thick one, worn at the corners from being handled. She didn't sit down. She said, "I kept these. Every chart of yours he overrode. Every flag he signed off as something else." Her hands were flat on the table, the way mine go flat on a table when I am holding something steady. I told myself I was keeping them in case there was ever a lawsuit. That's what I told myself. She looked at me, and for the first time in 2 years, she looked like a person and not a charge nurse. That wasn't why. I don't think I knew why. I just couldn't make my hand drop them in the bin. She slid the folder an inch toward me. If they're useful to whoever you're talking to, they're yours. I should have done more than keep a folder. I know that. I'm telling you anyway. I understood her completely, because I had a folder exactly like it, kept for the same reason she couldn't put into words. And so do you, probably, somewhere in your life. The box you never open and never throw out. Because the throwing out is the verdict, and you're not ready to read the verdict aloud. Brenda Okoro had not been brave. She'd been unable to be complicit all the way down. Sometimes that's the most a tired person inside a system can manage. And it turns out to be enough. Because her folder, 19 overridden charts with Preston Vaughan's signature dismissing what later proved true, became part of the federal record. The twist. The thing I'd started to see by the light of a parking receipt and Hector had named on the phone, turned out to be exactly what we'd both feared. And I'll give it to you plainly. Because in this kind of story, the plain truth is the whole point. I had not landed at Halverson Memorial by chance. The reorganization that ended my career in 2018 had not been about a budget. The complaint I'd filed about Arlen Medical's falsified testing had been real, and it had been buried. And the man who buried it had a name I had typed on 3 complaint forms with my own hands. Garrett Vance. In 2018. He was the oversight colonel who signed the single paragraph that dismissed me. By 2024, he was Arlen Medical's vice president of contracts. And somewhere in the years between, he had built the thing that mattered, a network of distribution deals that fed Arlen's hardware into small civilian hospitals across 4 states. Hospitals chosen for being small, for being overlooked, for being the kind of place where a failure reads as poor host healing, and a complaint reads as a difficult nurse. Halverson was one of them. My quiet exile to Cedar Hollow had been Garrett Vance's idea of safe. Put the inconvenient surgeon, somewhere her judgment would be discounted by default. Somewhere small enough that nobody important would ever ask her a question. And let the river do the rest. He had set me down, on purpose, 6 feet from the exact thing I'd been destroyed for naming. Because he was certain that being diminished would make me stop looking. That is the calculation. Every time. They count on the diminishment, doing the work. They count on you reading the cost, and deciding it's higher than the truth is worth. He was wrong about the one thing that mattered, which is that being diminished had never once made me stop looking. It had only made me quieter, while I did it. The federal investigation into Arlen Medical became public 11 days after the ceremony, and I'll give you the specifics. Because a consequence you can't count isn't a consequence. Arlen's hardware was pulled from 41 hospitals, across 4 states, a recall covering 19,000 orthopedic implants. Garrett Vance, the colonel who had reviewed my complaint in 2018, and decided 3 forms weren't worth a second paragraph, was indicted on 14 counts, including the falsification of federal testing records, which is its own special category of crime when the bodies it lands in belong to veterans, and the people of towns nobody chose to protect. The man who signed the paper that buried me signed his name to 14 federal counts, on the same fraud he'd buried me for naming. 2 hospital purchasing officers, including one at Halverson, resigned before they could be asked to. The estimated number of patients who'd received Arlen's defective hardware over 6 years, across all the sites, ran past 4,000. 4,000. There's the bigger number I promised you. Hold it next to the small one. 420 bad shifts, and you'll understand the trade I'd been making, without knowing the size of it. Every quiet swallow, every lowered center of gravity, every honey I let pass, had been the cost of staying in the room long enough to be standing in it on the day the dog walked in. I would not have chosen the price. If anyone had shown it to me up front, almost nobody would. But you don't get shown the price up front. You only get to decide, each ordinary morning, whether you're still willing to look. That's the whole job. It was always the whole job. Here is the part about the 2 kinds of metal. Because I told you the hardware mattered, and I keep my word. There was titanium in my knee, put there by a surgeon at Landstuhl 14 years ago, who told me exactly what it was. It ached when the weather turned, and it had never once lied to me. It did precisely the job it was certified to do, every day, for 14 years. Including the day it carried me down to the floor of an emergency room, to put my hand on Wyatt Boone's femoral artery. Honest metal. And then there was Arlen's medal, certified by forged paperwork, vetted by a colonel who later took the company's money to look away for a living. Screwed into the hips and femurs and spines of 4,000 people, who were never told, smoldering quietly in the bone of a diabetic grandmother, whose hospital had decided the problem was her. Same element on the periodic table. One had been told the truth about, and one had been built on a lie. And you could not see the difference by looking. You could only see it by what it did over time. In the dark, in the body. When no one important was paying attention. That is the only thing I know for certain about people too. You cannot tell the honest ones from the others by looking. You can only tell by what they do over time. In the dark, when there's nothing in it for them. Preston Vaughn looked like the trustworthy one. He had the title, and the suit, and the reputation in 3 counties. Garrett Vance looked like a man you'd salute. I looked like nobody. The metal in my knee knew which of us was which. A long time before the room did. Preston Vaughn was not charged with anything. He hadn't known. Willful ignorance isn't a crime. It's just a character. But the hospital board, facing a federal recall, and a major general's testimony about a surgeon their trauma chief had spent 2 years calling the wound care girl, conducted what the letter described as a review of clinical leadership culture. Vaughn kept his license. He did not keep his department. The last I heard, he'd taken a position at a smaller hospital 2 states over. Where I assume he tells a version of the story, in which he was the one who recognized me. People like Preston Vaughn always edit themselves into the good seat. It costs me nothing to let him. I have stopped keeping that kind of ledger. Halvorsen Memorial offered me a position. Director of Trauma Quality and Surgical Outcomes. A real title, a real office, a real salary. The kind of thing that, 3 years earlier, I'd stood in front of a closet deciding whether to bury forever. The administrator, a careful man named Glenn Tate, sat across a desk from me, and he said the thing administrators say when they're crossing something off a list they never wanted to be on. He said he owed me a closer read than he'd given me. You did, I said. I took the job. I was tired of declining rooms. I had earned. That's the other thing nobody tells you about being buried. When they finally hand you the thing they owed you all along, you don't feel triumphant. You feel the weight of every year you spent without it. And you take it anyway, because the alternative is letting the burial win twice. Daniel Cho, the resident whose wrist I'd caught over the chest tube, asked me to teach a Saturday seminar on field trauma assessment. He'd told the other residents. They came every Saturday. The good ones, Wyatt Boone had said, learned it somewhere that wasn't a classroom. I had finally found a classroom. I still made them learn the landmark 2 ribs lower than instinct wants to put it. Some lessons you pay for in the dark, and then you hand them over in the daylight, for free. So the next person doesn't have to pay the same way. Wyatt Boone and Atlas came to see me about 6 weeks after the ceremony, on a clear afternoon. Through the front doors this time, and not the ambulance bay. The thigh had healed clean, the vascular repair held. Atlas walked the length of the corridor without favoring anything, gray muzzle high, and he came to me and sat and leaned his weight into my leg, against the honest metal, and I crouched down to his level, the way my knee allowed. And I didn't say anything, and neither did Boone, because there are rooms where talking only makes the thing smaller. He had a postcard. Boone said finally, Cole, in Atlas's footlocker, when the dog came to me. I always wondered who it was for. He wrote it and never sent it. Bought 2, the guy said. Sent one somewhere, kept one. He took it out of his jacket. A cheap postcard, the kind they sell in a wire rack at a gas station. A picture of a mountain. He held it out to me. When the general said your name last month, I knew where the other one went. I've been carrying this around for 6 years, not knowing who to give it to. I already had its twin, taped inside my kitchen cabinet door. Cole Mercer had bought 2. Written the same 7 words on both. In block letters from a man who could field strip a rifle blindfolded, and wrote like a third grader. Sent me one, the autumn after Helmand, with no return address. Which is why I'd never been able to thank him. Which is why I'd taped it inside a cabinet, and read it every morning for years, without knowing whether the man who wrote it was alive. He hadn't been, for 6 of those years. The words were the only part of him that had made it home, and now both halves of them were finally in the same room. I'll tell you what they said. You've earned it, and so did Cole, twice over. You didn't have to. You did anyway. That was all. That was everything. 7 words from a dead man who'd carried a dog's life in his hands, written to the surgeon who broke a rule for him in the dark. And they turned out to be the truest description of the whole thing I ever found. Truer than Valkyrie. Truer than Colonel. Truer than any of it. You didn't have to. You did anyway. That's not a war story. That's just the only kind of person worth being. I water a small fern on the windowsill of my new office, every Tuesday and Friday. It was a gift from Daniel Cho, and it is not doing especially well. And it is not dying either. It is doing the slow, stubborn, unspectacular work of staying alive in a building that doesn't open its windows. The window looks out on the same parking lot, and the same water tower I used to see from the apartment above the hardware store. Because Cedar Hollow is a small town, and there is only so much to look at. On the cold mornings my knee still tells me the weather is turning, and I still move so the limp doesn't show, not because I'm hiding anymore, but because it's a habit. And because the metal earned the right to ache quietly. Both postcards are taped inside the cabinet at home now, side by side. I still drive out to the rock by the creek on Sundays. The creek still has no opinion about whether I'm a nurse or a colonel. I find I prefer it that way. Here is the only thing I'll say to you directly, because the rest of it I'd rather you take from what happened than from what I tell you. The world is full of rooms that have already decided who you are. They decide it fast, from the coat you're wearing, and the title on your badge, and the shift they put you on. And the deciding was never really about you. It was about them, and what they needed to be true. They are counting on the cost of being seen correctly to be higher than you can pay. So you'll pay the other price instead, the quiet one, and call it peace. Most people make that trade. Not from weakness, from arithmetic. From a fair reading of what a true word costs in a room that has agreed not to hear it. But arithmetic only works on someone who is still adding. The person they cannot price is the one who stopped doing the sum a long time ago. Who keeps choosing to look on every ordinary morning, not because she is sure it will be repaid, but because the alternative is a version of herself she will not live inside. I never waited to be vindicated. Vindication is weather. It comes when it comes, and mostly it doesn't. I waited to be sure. And certainty you can build with your own hands, one chart at a time, in faded scrubs, while they call you honey. The ones who price you are always astonished when the bill never comes due. They are the only ones who are. They called it Valkyrie, because they thought it meant choosing who dies on the field. It doesn't. I looked up the old meaning once. The real one underneath the one everybody uses. A Valkyrie doesn't choose the slain. She walks out onto the worst ground there is, and she carries them home, and she refuses to leave anyone on it, including, it turns out, herself. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need this reminder today. That being overlooked is not the same as being small, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who already knows exactly what she's worth.